It started as just another day in the life of Jeff Bezos, the billionaire entrepreneur, visionary, and one of the most powerful men in the world. He boarded his state-of-the-art Gulfstream G650, a marvel of luxury and technology, ready for what was supposed to be a routine flight. But little did he know, this trip would be anything but routine. At 35,000 feet high above the clouds, a storm was brewing, not outside the plane, but inside. Among the carefully curated guest list was a critic, notorious for his unfiltered opinions and sharp-tongued interviews. He had made it his mission to challenge Bezos, face-to-face, in the most unexpected setting. The tension was palpable. The critic, armed with biting questions and years of pent-up resentment, didn't wait long to unleash his tirade. Bezos, sitting calmly in the plush leather seat, simply listened, his expression unreadable. He looked like a man holding an ace up his sleeve. What followed was a battle of wits and wisdom. The critic's words were sharp, his arguments passionate. But when Jeff finally spoke, his response wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a masterclass in grace, intelligence, and unshakable confidence. What did he say that left everyone in stunned silence? How did he turn a moment of criticism into one of profound reflection? This story isn't just about a clash of opinions. It's about power, perspective, and the art of shutting down a critic without breaking a sweat. Buckle up, because this isn't just a story, it's an experience. One that takes us inside the mind of a man who built an empire and the critic who dared to challenge him. The ending will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Jeff Bezos. The name alone conjures images of towering skyscrapers, bustling fulfillment centers, and a legacy that reshaped how the world shops. As the founder of Amazon, he's been heralded as a genius entrepreneur and criticized as a symbol of corporate dominance. But if there's one thing Bezos is familiar with, it's scrutiny. Every decision, every move he makes, becomes headline news. On this particular day, however, as he stepped onto the glossy staircase of his Gulfstream G650, the stakes felt different. This wasn't just a private jet. It was a floating palace of innovation and luxury. Sleek leather seats, high-speed internet, and panoramic windows. It was a plane designed for a king. But even kings face challenges they don't expect. What Bezos didn't know was that among his passengers that day was someone who had spent years dissecting and criticizing his every move. A journalist, outspoken and relentless, whose scathing columns had painted Bezos as the face of greed and unchecked ambition. He had always been a voice from a distance, a critic shouting from the sidelines. Today, though, he wasn't shouting. He was seated just a few feet away, ready to take aim in person. As the engines roared to life and the jet ascended above the clouds, the critic's motives became clear. This wasn't just a flight for him. It was an opportunity, a rare chance to confront one of the most powerful men on the planet in an environment where there was no escaping the conversation. For Bezos, this wasn't just about defending his empire. It was about something bigger, redefining the narrative, silencing doubts, and proving that even at 35,000 feet, he could remain untouchable. But how do you respond to someone whose mission is to question your very existence? And what do you say when the stakes aren't just about you, but about everything you've built? As the jet soared higher, the tension in the cabin thickened. The critic's eyes were sharp, his demeanor confident, while Bezos sat quietly, a picture of composure. What was he thinking? Was he crafting a strategy, or simply waiting for the right moment to speak? Whatever it was, one thing was certain. This wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. The low hum of the Gulfstream G650's engines filled the cabin, blending seamlessly with the quiet luxury that surrounded its passengers. Jeff Bezos, seated in a custom-designed leather chair, had an air of calm focus. A sleek tablet rested in his hands, its screen glowing with blueprints for a new venture, another step toward pushing boundaries that most people wouldn't dare to imagine. His team sat scattered across the cabin, quietly working, their conversations hushed but purposeful. Occasionally, a soft chuckle broke the silence as someone shared a light moment. It seemed like just another business trip, until you looked across the aisle. There sat Martin Hayes, a journalist whose sharp pen and sharper tongue had earned him a reputation as one of Bezos' fiercest critics. Martin wasn't here for the scenery or the in-flight luxury. He was here with a purpose. For years, his columns had dissected Bezos' every move, accusing Amazon of exploiting workers, stifling competition, and turning convenience into a double-edged sword. And now, for the first time, Martin had the opportunity to confront his subject face-to-face. Martin adjusted his tie and leaned back, his eyes flicking toward Jeff, who was still engrossed in his tablet. The critic's mind was racing. He had questions, accusations, that had been simmering for years, and he was determined to bring them to the surface. The setting was intimate, almost too perfect for the confrontation he had planned. Jeff, on the other hand, seemed oblivious, or perhaps intentionally indifferent, to the tension building across the aisle. He occasionally glanced out the window at the endless expanse of clouds, his expression unreadable. Was he unaware of the storm brewing, or was he simply waiting for the right moment to address it? As the jet leveled out at cruising altitude, Martin couldn't hold back any longer. He leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin. You know, Jeff, not everyone thinks Amazon's success is a good thing. Some of us believe you've done more harm than good. The words hung in the air like a challenge, sharp and deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath. Jeff didn't flinch. Slowly, he placed the tablet on the table in front of him and leaned back, the corners of his mouth curling into a faint smirk. His eyes met Martin's, steady and unyielding. Interesting perspective. Care to elaborate? And just like that, the stage was set. The sparring match between one of the world's most powerful men and one of his most vocal critics had begun. The other passengers exchanged curious glances, sensing that this was no ordinary conversation. Some discreetly adjusted their seats, ready to witness what promised to be an unforgettable exchange. As Martin leaned forward, launching into his first salvo of critiques, Jeff remained composed, listening intently, occasionally nodding as if inviting more. What Martin didn't realize was that Jeff wasn't just listening. He was analyzing, preparing, and waiting for the perfect moment to deliver his response. The cabin's serene atmosphere seemed at odds with the growing tension in the air. Martin Hayes, the critic, leaned forward in his seat, his voice cutting through the hum of the jet engines. His words were sharp, laced with passion, and meticulously aimed at the man seated across from him. You've built your empire on the backs of the poor, Jeff, Martin began, his voice steady but heated. Your warehouses? Modern-day sweatshops. Your workers? They barely scrape by while you fly on jets like this. Jeff Bezos, who had been reclining in his chair, shifted slightly. His posture was still relaxed, but there was a subtle change, a quiet intensity behind his calm demeanor. He smiled, not in mockery, but as though he was savoring the challenge. If that were true, Jeff said, his voice measured and calm, don't you think the workers would be protesting outside? Don't you think they'd leave if they were truly unhappy? The exchange was direct, but it was far from over. Martin wasn't here to back down. He leaned in further, his eyes narrowing. They stay because they have no choice. He fired back, his voice rising. You've cornered the market, Jeff. You've made it so that small businesses can't compete. They can't fight back. You're not building opportunities, you're building monopolies. The words hung in the air, charged with emotion. For a moment, the other passengers pretended not to notice, but their stolen glances betrayed their interest. This wasn't just a debate, it was a clash of ideologies. Martin didn't stop there. He pivoted, broadening his attack. And let's talk about wealth inequality, Jeff. You're worth billions, billions. While the average Amazon worker can't afford basic healthcare. What kind of legacy are you really leaving behind? Jeff listened, nodding occasionally, his expression thoughtful. It was clear he wasn't rushing to respond. He was letting Martin speak, letting the words fill the cabin like a courtroom drama. And Martin, emboldened by the silence, continued, You talk about innovation, about changing the world, but at what cost? Martin's voice carried a righteous anger. You've crushed competition, exploited workers, and widened the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Is that the future you're proud of? The tension in the room was palpable now, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Jeff remained composed, his hands folded neatly in front of him. But his silence wasn't passive, it was strategic. He was calculating, weighing his response. As Martin's words echoed through the cabin, flashes of imagery filled the narrative. A bustling Amazon warehouse, workers scanning packages with precision, small business owners closing their doors, defeated, protests outside corporate offices, signs held high in defiance. Martin painted a picture of a world shaped by Jeff's decisions, and it wasn't a flattering one. And yet, there was no anger in Jeff's expression. No defensiveness. He leaned back, his eyes meeting Martin's with quiet resolve. Whatever he was about to say, it was clear he had been here before. He had faced criticism, he had heard the arguments, and today he had something different to offer. The jet soared through the skies, but inside, the conversation was grounded in weighty truths and heated emotions. Martin, for all his fervor, wasn't just attacking Jeff. He was challenging a system, a philosophy, a way of life. And Jeff, for all his silence, wasn't just listening. He was preparing. The first shot had been fired, and the battle of words was just beginning. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, charged with the weight of unspoken thoughts and emotions. Jeff Bezos had been silent, allowing every accusation, every pointed remark, to hang in the air. But now, he leaned forward, his expression no longer neutral. It was time to speak. "Let me tell you a story," he began, his voice steady but carrying an edge that immediately silenced the hum of idle whispers. A story about a woman named Maria. The critic shifted in his seat, caught off guard by the unexpected turn. Jeff continued, his tone laced with empathy and conviction. Maria was a single mother living in a small town in Ohio. Her life wasn't easy. She worked at a local retail store for years, barely making ends meet. And then, one day, the store closed its doors. She was left with no job, no savings, and a young son to care for. She told me she felt invisible, like her struggles didn't matter to anyone. The cabin grew quiet. Even the sound of the jet engines seemed to fade as Jeff's words filled the space. He spoke not just with logic but with the kind of sincerity that demanded attention. Maria came to Amazon, Jeff continued, his voice firm but warm. She started in one of our fulfillment centers, packing boxes for hours every day. But she didn't stop there. She took every opportunity to learn, to grow. She enrolled in our career choice program, went back to school, and today, Maria is one of our top managers. She oversees hundreds of employees, many of whom have stories just like hers. His words carried weight, painting a picture that challenged the critic's narrative. Maria wasn't just a worker. She was a symbol of what Amazon could offer to those willing to seize the opportunity. Jeff's gaze met the critic's, his tone sharper now. "So tell me," he said, leaning forward, "how does that story fit into your narrative? Is Maria's success an accident? Or is it proof that innovation and opportunity can coexist?" The critic faltered for a moment, his confidence visibly shaken. He had expected rebuttals about market forces or labor statistics, but not this. A personal, human story that defied his assumptions. Jeff didn't stop there. "Do you know how many people like Maria are out there? People who needed a second chance? Amazon isn't perfect, and I'll be the first to admit we have work to do. But to call us a monopoly or a machine without a soul, that's not just unfair, it's uninformed." The tension in the room reached its peak as Jeff delivered his final, cutting remark. "Critics love to talk about what's wrong with the system," he said, his voice rising slightly, "but how often do they step up with solutions? You talk about workers as though they're victims, but I see them as partners. Partners in building something extraordinary." A hush fell over the cabin. Even the critic, usually unrelenting, seemed momentarily lost for words. Jeff had done more than defend himself. He had shifted the narrative entirely. This was no longer a simple debate about policies or wealth inequality. It was a clash of perspectives, a collision of ideologies. And for the first time, the critics seemed to realize that Jeff Bezos wasn't just a billionaire sitting atop a corporation. He was a man with a vision, a leader who believed in the power of stories like Maria's. For a moment, the cabin seemed suspended in time. The hum of the engines faded into the background, replaced by the quiet weight of introspection. The critic, once so full of fire and conviction, now sat back in his seat, his expression a mixture of hesitation and contemplation. "But I didn't know that, the critic finally admitted, his voice quieter now. He stared out the window, the clouds rolling by like his own thoughts, shifting and reforming. I've been so focused on the headlines, I never looked at the full pictures. Across the aisle, Jeff Bezos offered a small smile, the kind that hinted at understanding rather than victory. He leaned back, fingers lightly drumming on the armrest of his chair. That's the thing about stories, he said, his tone calm yet compelling. They're powerful, but they're rarely complete. Critics like you push us to do better, to ask harder questions. And that's a good thing. But, he paused, his voice firm but kind, don't mistake critique for the whole truth. There's always more beneath the surface. The critic looked down, his fiery rhetoric now tempered by the undeniable humanity of the story he had just heard. He wasn't defeated. No, it was something deeper. A realization, perhaps, that his own perspective, while valid, wasn't the only one. Jeff, meanwhile, turned his gaze back to the papers in front of him, his demeanor as calm and unbothered as ever. But the critic's reaction hadn't escaped him. He took a sip of his drink, a quiet acknowledgement that the conversation had landed where it needed to. And yet, even as the tension in the room eased, there was a palpable sense of change, an unspoken understanding that both men, in their own way, had been heard. The critic had challenged Jeff with passion, but Jeff had answered with something more enduring, perspective. The conversation didn't end with applause or dramatic gestures. It ended with reflection, a quiet, shared respect between two very different minds. The critic sat back, lost in thought, while Jeff returned to his work, unfazed but perhaps, just perhaps, a little more thoughtful himself. This wasn't just a confrontation at 35,000 feet. It was a reminder that even in the most polarizing debates, there's room for dialogue, for understanding, for growth. Jeff Bezos didn't just shut down a critic that day, he did something far more powerful. He opened a door. This wasn't just a story about Jeff Bezos shutting down a critic at 35,000 feet. It was a story about perspective, the kind that only comes when you rise above the noise, literally and figuratively. It was about perseverance, the ability to hold your ground in the face of challenge, and most importantly, the power of addressing criticism with grace. Jeff didn't need to win the argument, and that's what made his response so impactful. He listened, reflected, and responded not with ego or defensiveness, but with stories, facts, and a level of composure that turned a heated debate into a meaningful exchange. The critic thought he was holding Bezos accountable, and perhaps he was. But what he hadn't anticipated was how much the encounter would hold a mirror to his own perspective. That's the beauty of dialogue. It forces us to rethink, to see the shades of gray in what we once viewed as black and white. Jeff's calm rebuttal wasn't just about proving a point. It was a lesson for all of us. A lesson that criticism isn't the enemy, it's an opportunity. An opportunity to learn, to grow, and to show the world who we truly are. And here's the takeaway for you. In life, we will all encounter critics. Some will challenge us to be better, while others will question our very purpose. The real power lies in how we choose to respond. Will we meet criticism with anger, or will we, like Jeff, rise above it with humility and strength? So now, the question is yours to answer. How would you respond in Jeff's shoes? Do you think his approach was the right one? Or would you have handled it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And before you go, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss more captivating stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember, every challenge is an opportunity to soar.